Well, welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to be looking at the Pacific theater of World War II. Previously, we looked at the European theater, of course, where the United States is fighting mostly Germany, but also all of their allies, which would have been Italy and others at the time. The Pacific theater, of course, is where the United States is fighting Japan. And that, of course, is what brings the United States into the war is the fight against Japan. So the last time we saw this was the attack on Pearl Harbor. And for months after Pearl Harbor, most news from the Pacific was pretty bad. What we see happen is that after Japan, that who had already, preemptively decided to try to take out the United States Navy, which is the reason for their attack on Pearl Harbor, was to try to take out the United States Navy or damage it or cripple it enough so that they wouldn't have to deal with that, knowing that they couldn't really confront United States naval strength on their own without that. So that's why they attacked Pearl Harbor when they did. And then from there on, for the next several months, Japan just seems to be on an unstoppable advance. Similar to how when the war first began in Europe, how Germany just went on this tear, this blitzkrieg invading and just conquering lands like Denmark and the Netherlands and everybody, with before people really even had time to react. The same thing is happening in the Pacific in the first couple of months of the war. So Japan continues after Pearl Harbor to capture several Allied posts in the Pacific, including Guam, including Hong Kong, the Wake Islands, several places. They just seem to be on kind of an unstoppable tear. That also will eventually include the Philippines. And if you recall, the Philippines at this point in time was still a colony of the United States. So this was a strategic location, certainly for the United States. And this was a really important location for Japan to take over offensively, because that was going to clear the way if they could diminish the United States, or they could occupy the Philippines. And the United States would not have possession of it anymore. That not only gives them more territory, but it clears the way for them to advance even further. It clears the way for them to then invade Australia. It threatens them there. And the Philippines were captured in the spring of 1942 after very ugly fighting. Americans are unable to defend it. The American commander there, General Douglas MacArthur, we'll mention him. I think he's actually next. No, he's not. So General Douglas MacArthur promises that, he alludes to the fact that, hey, we're going to come back. We're not going to leave the Philippines to the Japanese forever, but we have to retreat for now. But that was definitely one of the bigger defeats for the United States in these first couple of years of the war, was the Japanese capture of the Philippines. That also meant that 100,000 or so American forces were left behind in the Philippines that were captured by the Japanese and that were prisoners of war until the United States could make their return to try to recapture the Philippines. That led to thousands of prisoners as well as Filipinos being led on what became known as the Bataan Death March. The Japanese, as it came to be found out, were incredibly brutal captors, as well as very fierce and potentially very brutal fighters. So they captured, like I said, somewhere maybe as many as 100,000 American and Filipino prisoners, and they forced them to march up what is called the Bataan Peninsula, thus the name the Bataan Death March. They were forced to march 60 miles with little food, little water, to these prison camps, and they were brutally treated. If they fell out of line, they shot them or just left them. They weren't fed very well. They were ravaged by tropical diseases. They were stabbed. Thousands of the prisoners of war died on the Bataan Death March, and then thousands more died when they got to those prison camps. And you have to realize, for these soldiers in this situation, they didn't know if they were ever going to get back. They didn't know if the United States was ever going to be able to liberate them. That, for many of them, they were just sent to those horrible camps where, again, thousands more of them died. The Bataan Death March is considered one of the many, but one of the really notable atrocities and, human crimes committed during World War II. So the Philippines have been captured and are in Japanese control. And again, Japan seems to be on an unstoppable tear. But as fate would have it, America's luck will soon turn around in June of 1942 as a result of the Battle of Midway. This is going to become a decisive moment and a pivotal battle, a turning point in the War of the Pacific that's going to shift the momentum to the American side. Unfortunately for Japan, many argued that at this point they also became perhaps a little overconfident. They had been encouraged by these victories, and maybe went a little bit too far and started to underestimate the United States. And also in the United States, they had a good bit of luck going into Midway. Now, Midway is, and if you look at your map, you should have, you're probably given of the war in the Pacific. It's right kind of in the middle of the Pacific, almost immediately in between the Japanese mainland and the United States mainland. And you'll also notice on that map its proximity to the Hawaiian Islands. So the purpose or the reason why Midway was targeted by the Japanese was because of its proximity to the Hawaiian Islands. The idea there was to defeat the American fleet at Midway, and that would leave Hawaii more vulnerable, and then they could even access the American or the United States mainland from there. But unbeknownst to the Japanese, before they began their attack, for one thing, the United States had broken the Japanese code, and that ended up being a decisive factor in this battle before it even got started. The Japanese were planning a surprise attack on Midway, similar to what they had done at Pearl Harbor, but it wasn't a surprise because the United States knew they had broken the code and they knew exactly what was about to happen. So Midway was well reinforced. There was a diversionary effort where the Japanese tried to distract American forces and send them northward, but the United States didn't fall for it, only sent a little bit of a force northward, and they had their aircraft carriers and all of that ready to go when Midway was attacked. So they were aware of that, and they made use of that. And Midway ended up also kind of showing sort of a new day of naval warfare. This was a battle, the first one that was fought pretty much entirely in the air, all entirely where the two adversaries were never in plain sight of each other. The ships, the aircraft carriers, the destroyers, the battleships never got close enough to actually see each other. All the fighting and all of the bombing of the ships and the torpedoing of the ships and all of that was done by air. So it's really a new age and showing the importance of air fighting, of aircraft carriers, and so forth in this particular phase of the naval war. This ends up being a major victory for the United States. They will destroy several of the Japanese aircraft carriers and force the Japanese to call off their attack. And that becomes a decisive battle, a turning point, because it stops the Japanese offensive. Midway is a turning point in the Pacific because it stops the Japanese offensive. It turns around that offensive. They had been on that tear, just taking island after island, taking the Philippines. They seemed to be unstoppable, and it seemed unwinnable. But at Midway, the United States turns that around, and that ends up being a huge morale booster for the United States. It gave confidence. It kind of energized the United States, and Japan is pretty much on the defensive from there. That doesn't mean that there isn't going to continue to be fighting. Of course, there is. Some of the ugliest and costliest things are yet to come, but it is a defeat that Japan never fully recovers from. They never fully regain their naval strength and power that they lost at Midway. Now, a little bit off the subject, but still talking about the war in the Pacific, but a bit different. A particular individual that you'll want to know is General Douglas MacArthur. I mentioned him a moment ago. He is in command of American forces in the Pacific. So he's kind of Eisenhower's counterpart, whereas Eisenhower is commanding Allied forces in Europe. MacArthur will end up commanding Allied forces in the Pacific. Now, he's an Army commander, so you're talking about the ground stuff. So Midway, which was a naval battle, MacArthur would not have been command there. That was Admiral Chester Nimitz that commanded the fleet, but MacArthur commands the ground forces in the Pacific. So after Midway, the United States has momentum and the United States has encouragement. The United States decides to take advantage of that and chooses a strategy that they hope will bring about the best result, and it does. The strategy that the United States adopts from this point forward is what's called island hopping, which is a lot like what it sounds like. Island hopping was this tactic of strategically taking over, smaller positions, selectively attacking the enemy, by attacking the smaller islands, those that were not as well defended, kind of going after those smaller targets first, not going after, bypassing the ones that were, you would think, were more of a threat, and in a way they were immediately so. They were probably more of a threat, better fortified, but ones that would have been a whole lot costlier to go ahead and take over. But by going after the smaller ones, those that oftentimes might have been supplying other areas, it would cut off those more fortified positions. It would cut off those islands that they had bypassed from supplies, making them basically useless. So this policy of going after the small stuff and sort of like cutting the veins, cutting the arteries, so the bigger things would be pretty much useless and therefore easier to take over, without having to go through these all-out assaults that would have been incredibly costly. And so that becomes the United States' strategy in the Pacific over the next year or so, is going after these smaller positions, going after the ones that they could take over either by air or with ground forces, and kind of cut off the supply lines, cut off the air, and suffocate those positions that were better defended. And that works really pretty well and does render some of those other islands completely useless. And so the United States starts pushing closer and closer and closer towards the Japanese mainland. Ultimately, that being the goal, is being able to get close enough to the Japanese mainland to be able to invade Japan. Now, by 1944, they were doing pretty well with that. And so that did beg the question of, what about the Philippines? And is that important? Do we need to recapture the Philippines? There were some military commanders that saw the Philippines as kind of irrelevant at that point, or not so much irrelevant, but something that what shouldn't be top on the list, because they could take the Japanese mainland without the Philippines. They didn't need to get that first. But Macarthur was very adamant that they had to go back and recapture the Philippines. He felt it was part of a promise that he had made, because he did famously state to the Filipino people when they left, when they evacuated the Philippines, that I will return. And so he felt an obligation to do that. And so he wins that argument. And so in 1944, the recapture of the Philippines will begin in what becomes one of the largest battles in the Pacific, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which is when the Philippines was eventually recaptured. So this was a huge undertaking, an invasion of the Philippines of more than 100,000 American troops. This is Macarthur right here, waiting, famously and theatrically coming ashore on the Philippines, waiting through the water to come ashore in the Philippines. So Macarthur does return, fights his way inland in what was one of the greatest and largest and costliest naval battles of the war at Leyte Gulf. But the United States successfully recaptured the Philippines, liberated the prisoners in the camps and prison camps that we talked about a moment ago. Huge casualties, again, very ugly affair, very bloody affair. Cities in ruins in the Philippines. And this is also one of the first times we start to see the Japanese using the weapon of kamikaze pilots, which I imagine you've heard before. And they will continue to be a menace, and even more and more of a menace to American forces as they get closer to the Japanese mainland. The kamikaze pilots were the suicide bombers. These were Japanese pilots that would intentionally crash their planes, killing themselves into American targets, whether that be on the ground or American aircraft carriers, doing a heavy damage. And kamikaze pilots, not only were they themselves causing a lot of damage, but it was, it just kind of was a symbol, or became a symbol, for the kind of fighting they were dealing with and the kind of enemy they were fighting in the Japanese. And that these are people who culturally saw giving their life in battle as the most honorable thing a person could do, that surrendering or giving up was the most dishonorable thing a person could do. So there was no way the Japanese were ever going to surrender, that they would fight to the last man, that they would sacrifice themselves. They would not surrender. They did not believe in taking prisoners. That's one of the reasons why they treated American prisoners in the prison camps there in the Philippines so badly was they considered surrender to be dishonorable. So they did not deserve any sort of humane treatment. So that makes the fighting all more fierce and all more ugly in the Pacific because of that kind of cultural difference. So with the Philippines now retaken, the United States is getting closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. So that's where we'll pick up next time, as well as we'll go back to the European theater and talk about the closing in of Americans coming in from one front, the Soviets and the British Allied forces coming in from the Western Front, while the Soviets push forward on the Eastern Front, eventually resulting in the collapse of Nazi Germany. So we will look at that part of it next time.